The endless bureaucracy of the Ottoman Empire. The machinery of Ottoman administration. When you think of the Ottoman Empire, perhaps you picture grand mosques rising above Istanbul, or sultans in jeweled turbans issuing decrees from gilded halls. Yet beneath the grandeur that dazzled visitors lay a slower, quieter, and far more tedious foundation: bureaucracy. For centuries, the Ottoman state functioned not merely through armies and conquests, but through endless registers, scribes, taxes, and inspections. If empires are often built on war, they are sustained by paperwork, and the Ottoman Empire was no exception. To understand the daily grind of Ottoman officials, we must step inside the dusty offices, archives, and chancelleries where men hunched over ink-stained ledgers, recording the details of fields, harvests, and taxes with painstaking care. It was not glamorous work, but without it, the empire that stretched across 3 continents could not have endured. The need for bureaucracy. The Ottoman Empire at its height spanned Southeast Europe, Anatolia, the Middle East, and North Africa. Millions of subjects, speaking dozens of languages, lived under its rule. To govern such diversity required an intricate administrative system, one that could track land, collect revenue, and maintain order. Unlike the dramatic images of sultans on horseback, the true power of the empire often rested in ledgers, books that listed villages, households, crops, and livestock. These records determined how much tax each community owed, how many men could be drafted into the army, and what resources were available for campaigns. It is here that bureaucracy becomes both fascinating and numbing. Every detail mattered, and every detail had to be written down. The role of the scribes. At the center of this machinery stood the scribes. Known in Ottoman Turkish as katibs, these men were the backbone of administration. They worked in offices attached to the central government in Istanbul and in provincial capitals across the empire. Their tools were simple: parchment or paper, ink made from soot and gum, and reed pens sharpened with knives. Their task was monumental: to record every decree, tax, census, and land survey with accuracy. The Ottomans prided themselves on meticulous records. In fact, some of these ledgers, known as Tahrir Defterleri, land registers, still survive in archives today, filled with careful columns of names, numbers, and notes. The scribes' world was not one of excitement. They sat for hours, copying decrees, checking sums, and ensuring consistency. Mistakes were dangerous, for an error in tax assessment could spark disputes, while a misplaced decree could anger powerful officials. Accuracy was survival. The land surveys. One of the most important bureaucratic tasks was the land survey. Periodically, the Ottoman government dispatched officials to measure fields, list households, and record resources. These surveys were massive undertakings, involving teams of scribes, local notables, and inspectors. Imagine the scene. A small group of officials arrives in a village. They set up under the shade of a tree or in a mosque courtyard. Villagers gather nervously, presenting their land and animals for inspection. The officials ask questions, cross-check answers, and write everything down. Each family's holdings are listed. So many sheep, so many acres of wheat, so many fruit trees. The process was tedious, often lasting weeks or months in a single province. The resulting registers filled hundreds of pages, bound and stored in state archives. They were not meant for casual reading, but for the cold calculation of taxes and obligations. The tedium of taxation. Taxes were the lifeblood of the Ottoman state, and collecting them was a labyrinth of paperwork. Some taxes were paid in kind, grain, animals, or produce. Others were paid in coin. Still others were labor obligations, like repairing roads or serving in the army. To track these, scribes recorded every detail: the amount owed, the amount collected, the balance remaining. Officials compared records to ensure nothing was missed. Discrepancies led to inquiries, sometimes punishments. For the villagers, tax time was a season of anxiety. For the scribes, it was a season of endless writing. Archives and records. The Ottomans were obsessed with preserving records. Archives filled with scrolls, ledgers, and decrees were kept under guard. Fire, damp, or neglect could ruin years of work, so great care was taken to protect documents. The Topkapi Palace in Istanbul housed some of the empire's most important archives, and provincial centers maintained their own collections. The organization of these archives reflected the empire's obsession with order. Documents were cataloged, indexed, and cross-referenced. A decree might be copied into multiple ledgers to ensure it was not lost. For the clerks who maintained these archives, the work was repetitive but vital. Day after day, they sorted, stacked, and stored paper, the human side of bureaucracy. Behind the records were people. Scribes were not faceless machines. They were men with ambitions, frustrations, and anxieties. Some hoped to rise through the ranks, gaining positions of influence in the imperial chancery. Others resigned themselves to lives of copying, never leaving the dim offices where they began. Marginal notes sometimes reveal their humanity. A scribe might complain of poor ink, of hunger, or of a cold office. Others left prayers for forgiveness if they had made mistakes. The bureaucracy, though designed for precision, was carried on the backs of ordinary men who endured its monotony. The scale of the grind. Consider the sheer volume of paperwork. For each province, dozens of registers were kept, one for land, one for taxes, one for court cases, one for decrees. Each year brought new entries, new corrections, new disputes. The empire lasted for centuries, and so the piles of documents grew. In many ways, the Ottoman Empire was built not only on battlefields, but also in archives. Without scribes, the system would collapse. Without ledgers, taxes could not be collected, armies could not be paid, and order could not be maintained. The Ottoman bureaucracy was a machine of ink and parchment, a system where survival depended on writing things down. For the scribes, the days blurred together. The same ledgers, the same numbers, the same decrees. Yet their dull, endless work sustained one of the greatest empires in history. But this was only the beginning. If bureaucracy was a machine, who oiled its gears? How were these countless records actually used in practice? In the courts, the provinces, and the daily disputes of ordinary people. Bureaucracy in action, courts, disputes, and daily administration. If Section 1 showed us the scribes hunched over their ledgers and the massive records of land and tax, we now step into the real world where those papers came alive. Bureaucracy was not merely an exercise in endless writing. It was the operating system of the empire, the bridge between subjects and sultan. Every petition, dispute, and demand filtered through its channels. And while the process was slow, it was also astonishingly thorough. The court as bureaucratic theater. At the center of this process stood the Ottoman courts, known as Sharia courts, Sarai Makameleri. These were not only religious institutions, but bureaucratic hubs where records were created and preserved. Every dispute, whether over land, inheritance, marriage, or taxes, produced paperwork. Judges, or qadis, presided, but scribes sat beside them, recording proceedings in bound registers. Imagine the scene. Villagers file into a dim courtroom in a provincial town. The cadi sits at a desk with scrolls and ledgers, flanked by scribes with reed pens ready. One villager complains that his neighbor has taken more than his share of irrigation water. Another claims his cousin has withheld inheritance. Each testimony is written down, line by line, in formal Ottoman Turkish. The session ends not with a handshake, but with a seal pressed into parchment. Thus, the court was not only a place of judgment, but a factory of records. Each case fed the ever-growing archives, ensuring that every quarrel became part of the empire's official memory. Petitions and the imperial chancery. Ordinary subjects could appeal directly to the central government through petitions, arzul. A farmer who believed his taxes were unfair, or a widow whose land had been seized, could draft a petition, often with the help of a scribe. These were sent to Istanbul, where clerks in the imperial chancery read, copied, and filed them. The petitions reveal the empire's daily grind. One might complain that a tax collector was too harsh, another that a soldier had stolen grain, another that a neighbor had built a wall across a path. Each was read, logged, and often annotated with orders for further inquiry. The sheer volume was staggering. Imagine hundreds of petitions arriving each week, each requiring review. Scribes copied them into registers, while clerks assigned them to officials for action. For the petitioners, the process could take months or years. For the bureaucrats, it was simply the day's work. Tax disputes and audits. The lifeblood of bureaucracy was tax, and so tax disputes filled the registers. Villages sometimes claimed that harvests had failed due to drought, begging for relief. Tax collectors countered with accusations of dishonesty. To settle such cases, inspectors were dispatched, carrying orders written in careful script. They interviewed villagers, examined fields, and returned with reports. The reports themselves were dull but vital, lists of acres planted, bushels harvested, and animals counted. If fraud was suspected, punishments followed. If hardship was real, taxes might be reduced. Each outcome, once again, was recorded in ledgers. Audits were equally tedious. Periodically, central officials reviewed the accounts of provincial treasuries. Clerks compared receipts, payments, and balances, checking for discrepancies. The process was slow, involving endless columns of figures, but it ensured that the empire's revenues were not swallowed entirely by corruption, bureaucracy, and daily life. For the average subject, bureaucracy was both a burden and a lifeline. It burdened them with taxes, inspections, and regulations. But it also offered channels of appeal and protection. A widow could bring her grievance to court. A village could petition for tax relief. Even if the process was slow, the very existence of bureaucracy meant that disputes did not always have to end in violence. Still, the process was exhausting. Imagine being a farmer summoned to court over a tax dispute. You walk for miles, wait in line for hours, and finally state your case before the cuddy. You return home uncertain, knowing that the real decision lies in registers carried to Istanbul. Your life hangs on parchment, provincial officials, and the grind of governance. The empire relied on provincial officials to implement its policies. Governors, beylerbey, judges, and tax collectors were all enmeshed in bureaucratic chains. They sent reports to Istanbul, received decrees in return, and constantly wrote letters. A governor might receive dozens of orders in a week: to send grain to a garrison, to resolve a land dispute, to recruit men for war. Each order required paperwork, receipts, confirmations, and reports. For the governor's scribes, the work never stopped. Even in times of peace, the quills scratched late into the night. The endless registers. Every bureaucratic action ended in a register. Court cases, petitions, tax accounts, audits, all were copied and bound. The registers multiplied, filling shelves in provincial offices and central archives. A single land survey might fill volumes, while annual tax accounts filled more. This accumulation gave the empire a sense of continuity. A dispute over land could be traced back through decades of records. A village's tax obligations could be checked against registers from earlier reigns. The bureaucracy was slow, but it was also durable, creating a paper memory that stretched across generations. The monotony for bureaucrats. For the men who lived within this system, life was repetitive. Clerks copied the same phrases day after day. It is ordered that, according to the register, by decree of the Sultan, their eyes blurred, their hands cramped, their backs ached from sitting at low desks. Yet the empire demanded it. A young scribe might begin by copying petitions. After years, he might rise to reviewing tax registers. If he was especially skilled, he might become a senior clerk in the imperial chancery. But most remained anonymous, their names lost in the margins of documents. They endured the grind without fame, sustained only by their wages and the faint hope of promotion. The Ottoman bureaucracy in action was both a machine of control and a lifeline of order. It was slow, repetitive, and exhausting, but it bound the empire together. For villagers, it was the path to appeal. For governors, the the chain of command. For scribes, the daily grind. And yet, for all its thoroughness, bureaucracy could also choke itself. Too many registers, too much paperwork, too many delays. These clogged the system as much as they sustained it. Which raises the next question. How did the Ottoman Empire's bureaucracy, so vast and meticulous, eventually contribute to its own stagnation? The strengths, weaknesses, and legacy of Ottoman bureaucracy. We have followed the Ottoman bureaucracy from its scribes' cramped offices to the courtrooms and provincial registers where disputes were written down and resolved. Now, in this final section, we step back and examine the long arc of the system. The Ottoman bureaucracy was both the empire's backbone and its burden, capable of sustaining vast rule across continents, but also so heavy and slow that it often became a weight dragging the state down. The strengths of the system. To understand why the empire endured for centuries, we must first acknowledge the strengths of its bureaucracy. Continuity and memory. Registers preserved decades, sometimes centuries, of data. A dispute over farmland could be traced back to a previous survey, and obligations of a village could be checked against older records. This gave the empire a long institutional memory. Consistency. Across distant provinces, from the Balkans to the Levant, the same forms, language, and methods were used. A petition in Damascus was recorded much like one in Sarajevo. This consistency provided stability across diversity. Flexibility through detail. Because the bureaucracy produced such detailed records, it could adapt taxes to circumstances. In years of drought, taxes could be reduced. In times of plenty, they could be raised. While harsh, the system had a built-in mechanism for adjustment. Without this administrative backbone, the empire could not have held together such diverse populations for so long. The weight of excess. Yet the very qualities that made the bureaucracy effective also made it suffocating. The empire's insistence on recording everything created overwhelming paperwork. Registers filled shelves upon shelves, too numerous for clerks to consult efficiently. Reports often duplicated one another or contradicted each other, creating confusion. Delays became notorious. A petition might take months or years to reach a resolution. Provincial officials often complained that orders from Istanbul were slow to arrive or contradictory when they did. The Sultan's decree might be carefully copied into ledgers, but its arrival weeks late made it useless in practice. By the 17th and 18th centuries, these delays were a serious weakness. Corruption and loopholes. No system of bureaucracy is immune to corruption. In the Ottoman Empire, clerks and local officials learned how to exploit the paperwork. A tax collector might underreport collections, pocketing the difference. A scribe might adjust a register in exchange for a bribe. Villages, too, learned how to play the system. They might conceal households, underreport livestock, or exaggerate hardship to reduce taxes. Inspectors sent from Istanbul could sometimes be bribed to overlook discrepancies. The very detail of the bureaucracy created opportunities for manipulation. A clever official might not need to defy the system. He only needed to drown it in paper. The burden on ordinary people. For subjects of the empire, bureaucracy was both protection and oppression. It offered courts where disputes could be heard, but it also demanded constant paperwork and taxes. The process was often alienating, especially for those who did not speak Ottoman Turkish or who struggled to navigate its complex forms. Imagine being a villager summoned to court. You might not understand the language of the scribes. You might be intimidated by the Qadi's authority. You might feel that the system was not designed for you, but against you. And yet, you had no choice but to submit to its processes, for the paper trail was law. Bureaucracy as a double-edged sword. Historians often describe the Ottoman bureaucracy as a double-edged sword. On one hand, it provided order, stability, and longevity. On the other, it sapped energy, delayed action, and fostered corruption. When the empire was expanding, the system was manageable. New lands meant new registers, but the momentum of conquest kept resources flowing. When expansion slowed in the 17th century, the weight of paperwork grew heavier. Without new conquests to fund administration, the bureaucracy increasingly consumed itself. The 19th century reform attempts. By the 19th century, Ottoman reformers recognized the need to modernize. The Tanzimat reforms, 1839 to 1876, introduced new codes, new ministries, and attempts to streamline administration. Paper replaced parchment, printed forms replaced handwritten ledgers, and Western-style offices were introduced. Yet the old habits of bureaucracy lingered. Even as new institutions arose, the empire's culture of meticulous record-keeping and slow processes remained. For ordinary subjects, the grind of petitions, ledgers, and courts continued much as it had centuries earlier. Legacy of the archives. If the bureaucracy was exhausting for the Ottomans themselves, it is a treasure for historians today. The empire's obsession with record-keeping left behind one of the richest archives in the world. Millions of documents survive in Istanbul's archives, detailing every aspect of daily life. Tax lists, petitions, court cases, and decrees. Through these records, we glimpse the lives of ordinary villagers, farmers, soldiers, and merchants. We read their complaints, their disputes, their pleas. The very monotony of the paperwork created a vast historical memory that now allows us to reconstruct the rhythms of Ottoman life in extraordinary detail. The human cost. And yet, for the men who created those records, the legacy was not glory but monotony. They spent their days hunched over ink and paper, writing the same phrases again and again. Few are remembered by name. Their reward was a wage, sometimes modest, sometimes comfortable, but rarely fame. Their grind was the empire's stability, their boredom the empire's longevity. Without their patience, the Ottoman machine might have collapsed much earlier. To be an Ottoman bureaucrat was to live in a world of ink and repetition. It sucked because the work was endless, the recognition absent, and the system both rigid and corrupt. But it also mattered. Their ledgers built an empire, preserved its memory, and shaped its legacy. So, When you imagine the Ottoman Empire, picture not only the sultans and soldiers, but also the anonymous scribes scratching at their papers, sealing decrees with wax, and stacking ledgers on dusty shelves. Their boredom was as much the foundation of the empire as any battle or mosque.